Story 1. I was super lucky to witness this. When I was in fourth grade or so, my family went on a trip to Yellowstone. On one of our long day drives, we were on one side of a valley and saw a few cars pulled off the road. There was a guy with a telescope set up, so we pulled over. It was just around sunset, perhaps just after, and he waved for us to come over and take a look. I saw two wolves running on the edge of the tree line on the other side of the valley. One was dark brown or black, and the other was white. As I was watching, he explained that these were the first wild wolves to return to this area in like 50 or something years. I remember how they were just running together side by side like two dogs you'd see at a dog park. On that same trip, we got to watch a mother grizzly and her two cubs hunting deer across a massive field. The herd would run off, and the mother grizzly would circle back to see if they had left any calves hidden in the grass. It seemed like she had no luck, so she came up towards the road where there were about 100 cars all taking photos and videos. This was like 2003, so imagine a bunch of big bulky cameras on tripods. Grizzlies move fast as hell, so everyone was suddenly stuffing their equipment and bodies back into their cars as this bear quickly neared us. She was used to it though and just walked right across the road, up a hill, and started digging through a big log for grubs. Edit. Sorry, not caribou. Mule deer might have been what we saw. It wasn't a herd of bison, I can remember that. This was over 20 years ago. Story 2. Sometime in the fall years ago, I was walking on a remote country road, cornfields on one side, the river on the other, and saw monarch butterflies everywhere, hundreds of them. At the time, I didn't know what was going on but enjoyed them on my 2-mile hike. Went back the next day and didn't see a one. I later learned I got to witness a monarch migration. Story 3. An elderly woman fell over dead in Terminal 3 at O'Hare Airport in line at the McDonald's a few years ago. I called 911 and people were doing compressions, but it took 10 minutes for paramedics to arrive, and she was gray and didn't have a pulse. Story 4. A drunk person fell on the subway rails with a train incoming. People managed to pull him up at the last moment. It was a really sobering experience, and I stopped drinking after that. Story 5. My father's body. I was 15, this was during COVID-19, so I was in online school. It was just after 8 a.m. in the morning, and I was sleepily sitting on my bed with my laptop open to the Zoom meeting. I heard screams and sobs from my parents' room, so I ran into their room to find my mother and brother standing beside the bed, screaming and crying, and my father, lifeless in bed. I'll never forget aimlessly trying to revive him while my mother screamed his name. I miss you, Dad. Story 6. About 20 years ago, I was driving up the mountains of western Wyoming one morning at the end of a mild rainstorm. To my left was a rainbow that appeared to follow me just a few yards away from my car. As I turned a corner, the rainbow seemed to drop directly into a mountain lake. I wish I had found a place to pull over and take it in longer. Story 7. When I was returning from a school camp, I saw an accident that I will remember for the rest of my life. On one side, there was an overturned smoking bus full of people. On the other side, there was a car in which I saw a woman with flowers in her hands, who was already dead. I was 10 and I will never forget it. Story 8. I was on an oceanographic expedition on my night shift. A friend and I were the only ones on the deck. Then we saw something shiny in the water, and it was a bunch of glowing dolphins. They were playing among some bioluminescent organisms, got covered in them, and they turned bioluminescent themselves, all this while they were swimming and jumping in the dark water. It was the most incredible thing I ever saw in my life. Story 9. Fireflies. All of them, around 1979 or so, outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I was driving with the top down around sunset, just cruising through the countryside. I drove along the sweeping right-hand curve with pastures on the right, probably 100 yards or more to the tree line. There were millions of fireflies, it seemed. I remember thinking at the time, there's got to be a firefly for every cubic foot up to about 5 or 6 feet high. Just millions of them rising from the pasture, blinking and glowing, just doing firefly things. I actually pulled over and watched for a little while. I've never seen that kind of numbers before or since. That was 45 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. Story 10. I was once first on the scene to a pedestrian hit by a car. I was just a pizza delivery guy but got there before anyone else. Her arms were obviously broken, and her face was road-rashed really badly. She was not breathing, but as I was about to move her to start cardiopulmonary resuscitation, she thankfully started breathing. Thankfully, the police got there within a minute, and I went to console the guy who hit her. She bolted out in front of him when he had a green light. He was also a frequent customer that I delivered to and gave rides home from parties when he was drunk. I never saw him after that. I hope he is okay. I never heard what happened to the woman either. Story 11. A pod of dolphins guided me toward our tour boat in Hawaii. I had gotten separated from my partner and swallowed too much seawater. I couldn't see the boat, but these dolphins appeared. We weren't supposed to touch them, so I went in the opposite direction from where they came. About 5 minutes later, the boat showed up in front of me, and they pulled me onto the deck. The tour guide said they do that sometimes if they can tell someone is in trouble. They were the only other people to see the pod behind me, and sadly, by the time someone thought to take a picture, the dolphins had already gone. Story 12. To answer this, I must explain the time and setting. I was having dinner with my family in downtown Manhattan to start college. Before dinner, I went to the observation deck at the World Trade Center. It was a beautiful afternoon around dusk. I was thinking to myself how lucky I am to be going to college in my home city, but I did not have a camera. Cell phones did not have them yet, kids. So, I just took it all in, how cool it is to see Manhattan from the tallest building in the city. This was Friday, September 7th, 2001. Story 13. My mom was walking back to our house with her hands covered in blood. A girl I went to school with was driving too fast down our street and didn't slow at an intersection. She hit a much smaller car carrying a family. The only person not buckled was the driver of the smaller car, a mom who was driving her family. She was thrown through the sunroof and struck the curb. Mom heard the crash and went running. She was a critical care nurse and always first to help, without thinking. She held the woman's skull together in her hands until the ambulance came, but it was too late. My classmate had a car full of friends and none of them were injured, and the dad and kids in the small car were injured but survived. The girl I went to school with didn't even get a ticket. Small town, wealthy family. I will never shake that image. Story 14. I was 3. My brother was 13. I'm guessing it's one of my first memories, honestly. But I remember coming home with my mom and seeing a drawer open with pills everywhere. Then I follow my mom to his room, and I see him sprawled out on the floor with vomit all around him. He tried to kill himself. He was in a coma for 2 weeks, but he's still alive. Never will forget it, though, and I don't think he knows I remember it so well. Story 15. I was paddleboarding and out of nowhere, 2 seaplanes came around the bend and took off right in front of me. They swerved a lot and nearly hit each other. They looked like they were going to fall out of the sky, and I was right beneath them. It scared me half to death, and I still wonder if they were qualified or maybe stole the planes. Whatever it was, they did not look like they knew what they were doing. Story 16. I saw a hawk and a crow side by side on the same branch. They took off as I approached, flying away from me, doing little barrel rolls together like they were playing. Story 17. I moved to Canada in January from the southern United States, and just a few weeks after I got here, I saw the Northern Lights. It was spectacular and life-changing. Story 18. A former coworker huffing from a can of air, standing up too quickly, then pitching forward and smacking her skull on the corner of a granite table. I will never forget the sound her head made. Bled a lot too. Story 19. I was comforting my dad on the balcony when I was an early teen. I said he's not a bad person, to which he replied, "You haven't even seen how bad I am. I'm 25 now and still remember it vividly, and still have no idea what he was talking about." Story 20. A mini tornado was playing basketball, and suddenly all the leaves, dirt, and cans on the floor just started spinning up in the air, moving across the court. There was this mini tornado. Story 21. April 27, 1984. An F3 tornado tore through southeast Wisconsin, roughly half a mile from where I lived. The National Weather Service said it was a rare tornado that didn't spawn from a low-hanging wall cloud. The thing dropped out of the sky from nearly 10,000 feet and was visible for miles. Scared me. Story 22. A man landed his parachute in our school's soccer field. This was in the year 2004 or 2005 when I was in 4th or 5th grade, and it was completely random because we were just having recess when suddenly this man landed his rainbow-colored parachute out of nowhere. The police arrested him because apparently he didn't have any permits or something, but all the kids were cheering and laughing. Story 23. Years ago, while waiting at the stoplight, I saw a man in broad daylight standing at the corner of a building. He casually dropped his pants and squatted, relieving himself. I couldn't believe it. A grown man doing this and not having any care in the world. I don't know why I can't ever get this out of my mind. I just kept staring in shock, and he didn't even wipe, just pulled up his pants. Story 24. The space shuttle piggybacking a ride on the back of a jumbo jet. It flew over my school, and we got early recess to watch it fly over. I was in grade 2 or 3 back in the early 1980s. Story 25. Back in the late 1980s, I went to a tiny village at the top of some Andean mountain in the hopes of seeing condors the next dawn. The people there were all native Quechua speakers but also spoke Spanish. They were all farmers. The other half-dozen tourists and I had a communal-style dinner and were about to retire when the town turned off the generator that was the sole source of power. It was a perfectly clear night. I wasn't fortunate enough to see condors the next day, but I will never forget the sight of the sky that night. I doubt I will ever see so many stars again, and I wonder if more than a handful of people today ever will. Story 26. The nurse telling me my baby no longer had a heartbeat. I've never seen someone's face drop like that. Her change of tone immediately. It felt more traumatic than the actual words she spoke after. Story 27. I saw a meteorite flying right at me and watched it explode. I thought it was a light from something way up on the side of a mountain in Arizona as I was driving west along Interstate 40, and I was trying to remember what was there, as I had driven across Arizona a lot. Then it just boomed and startled me a little until I figured out what had happened. Story 28. The solar eclipse. Saw totality and completely understand why there are people who spend their time and money traveling to every eclipse they possibly can. Pictures, videos, written descriptions all pale in comparison to how it felt to see it. Story 29. This is a little lighter than most of the posts here. I was driving with my family in the car in the middle of the night, like 2 or 3 a.m., in absolute nowhere rural Ohio, no town for miles. Way up ahead, I saw a Pepsi machine on the side of the road. I could see it for miles because there was nothing else nearby lit up. It was beside some small industrial building that was clearly closed for the night. I thought, how bizarre to see a vending machine here. As we drove by, my wife and I saw 2 people walking up to the machine to buy a soda, like it was the most normal thing in the world to be buying a soda from a Pepsi machine in desolate nowhere at 3 a.m. We kept talking about it and quoting spies like us, saying, "Why don't you gentlemen have a Pepsi?" all night. I felt like we were extras in a David Lynch movie. Story 30. Comet Hale-Bopp. I was 9 years old, standing on the balcony and crying because I thought it was the most beautiful thing but also the end of the world, thanks to the fear-based religious upbringing I had to endure. Story 31. A herd of sheep, or about 5 or 6 sheep in the herd, getting annihilated by a freight train. They flew way higher than I expected when hit. An awful thing to see. Story 32. We were the last riders to go on the roller coaster because of a big storm. Lightning started flashing everywhere. As we crept up the hill, it started raining. We started down, and the lightning and the rain were so fantastic. Scary and super fun at the same time. Story 33. I was driving down the middle lane of a 3-lane highway close to midnight. I began climbing a hill, and as I crested it, directly in front of me was a perfect horizontal fingernail moon. I knew at the time I was seeing something I'd never see again. Story 34. The summer of 2012, I was down in the Grand Canyon camping with my friends. A young boy and his 2 friends tried to swim behind Mooney Falls, which is an incredibly tall waterfall with a shallow pool creating a huge undercurrent. The friends made it behind, but the boy got sucked under. His body barreled underneath the falls until it was spit out in the lagoon. My friend's mom and a few other people attempted cardiopulmonary resuscitation on him, and we watched from the top of the falls. I will never forget when they called it and pulled out a body bag. Story 35. Waking up in the Half Dome base camp with a bear standing over me in the middle of the night. There was no food in my backpack right next to me, but the bear was sniffing it anyway. I was terrified and played dead. Story 36. Bad. When the circus came to town in the 1990s with real animals, I was in the second row, and the elephants went around in a circle while the women were doing twists a few stories up, and one fell 10 feet from us. Splat. They turned off the lights, and the elephants went nuts. Good. It was my first time in Washington in the Sound, and we went crabbing. We saw a pod of orcas coming, and a seal jumped in the boat just like the video on the Reddit that often gets reposted. The orcas popped their heads up and watched him. It was scary at first, but pretty cool looking back. The seal got away. Story 37. An orca came right up to our boat during a whale watching trip and smiled at us, posed for pictures, then swam around the boat and moved on. Even the captain of the vessel said it was one of the top 5 trips he'd ever taken.